Welcome back to Chapter 2, and in this chapter we're going to be talking about how elements come together. Now in HTML, one element can be nested within another element. In fact, multiple elements can be nested inside of other elements. In this particular example, you see an H1 element and an A element nested inside of a header element. So these two elements would be considered children of the header. They would also be considered siblings of one another. We often use family-related metaphors when discussing HTML elements. Now, when working with markup and nesting elements, it's important to keep things organized in order to best be able to read a document. In this case, you see I've indented the children within the parent. In terms of organizational best practice, it's just a good idea to pick an indentation style and stick with it. Different organizations have different indentation styles. Some use spaces, some use tabs. There is no right way to indent except to indent, and to make sure that your team or the people that you're working with are consistent from document to document. Because again, coming in and being able to see a consistent indent style makes it easier to edit files later on. So if you like using two spaces to indent, great. If you like using a tab to indent, perfect. Pick a style and go with it. Now, when we nest elements within one another, we create relationships between those elements. We often use family metaphors in order to discuss how elements are related to one another, and when we diagram how they're related, we often use a tree. So here you can see the header element is the parent, and it has two children, the H1 and the anchor element. Taken together, these form the document object model. Now what's particularly interesting here is that the header element was introduced in HTML5. So older browsers don't know what to do with the header element. But thankfully, there's a rule for how browsers handle elements that they don't understand. They ignore them. Now how this plays out in terms of our markup example is that browsers that understand the header element will see the entirety of this markup. They'll see a header, and then inside of the header they'll see an H1 and an anchor. Browsers that don't understand the header element will ignore it entirely, but they'll expose the contents inside. This is an important feature of HTML, and it's what allows the language to evolve over time. Now, when choosing elements within HTML to mark up our documents, we should choose elements that make our content more meaningful. HTML is intended to make our documents more expressive. Here we have just a normal passage of content from my Cuttlefish page. And if we were to view this in the browser, this is what it would look like. Straight, normal, Times New Roman. Now if I wanted to start marking up the document, I might decide to link a brown pigment to the Wikipedia article on sepia. And when I do that, now all of a sudden, that becomes a link within the document. That's what the anchor tag does. And we'll talk a little bit more about the anchor tag later on. Continuing on, if I wanted to call out certain terms as being in an alternate voice, alternate mood, or an alternate language, I could use the I element. Now as you see here, I've got several instances of the I element marked up in green, and each of them has a lang attribute, which indicates the language that the term or terms within the element is in. Again, flipping over to the browser, all of these I elements are rendered in italics, which visually sets them apart from the normal text of the page. But the markup actually has additional information inside of it that provides context around the language that that particular term or terms are in. Taking things a step further, this entire paragraph is a paragraph. Therefore, I can wrap it in a P element, and then that will insert some margins above and below this particular block of text. All in all, HTML is intended to allow our documents to be more meaningful, to provide more context to people who are reading them. This is what we refer to as semantic HTML. In this chapter, we talked about element nesting, how elements come together to form the DOM. We talked about fault tolerance, which will come up time and time again as we're discussing HTML and CSS. And then finally, we talked about the importance of semantic HTML to provide more meaning to our documents. In the next chapter, we'll wrap up a little bit more of the introduction to HTML with talking about how to comment your HTML and what's meant by character encoding. I'll see you in a few minutes.